Hey Siri, shut down.
Go ahead.
All right. All right. Nicole, will you let me know when you're ready, if we've gone live?
We're live.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So hello, everybody. It's great to see you. Thanks for joining our virtual webinar, The Upper Limit, How Much Sea Level Rise is Too Much, as part of Florida Climate Week. In a moment, we'll get to our guest experts. But first, I'm Kim Ross. I'm the co-executive director of ReThink Energy Florida. Our mission is to educate, engage, and empower Floridians to take action to achieve a just transition to clean energy through youth education, adult engagement, and community organizing. Just a few housekeeping items. Some of our attendees are on Zoom and some are on the Whova app. Everyone is on mute. If you're on Zoom, we ask that you put any questions you have in the chat. And if you're on the Florida Climate Week Whova session, please put your questions in the Q&A section. Thanks to Nicole Salzberg with the Volo Foundation, we're monitoring both platforms and we'll ask our esteemed guests questions after both speak. We'd like to express our gratitude to the Volo Foundation for helping make this happen, and to Dr. Andrea Dutton and Rafe Pomerance for being willing to speak on this important topic. Finally, if you aren't a part of Florida Climate Week, I will share the link in the Zoom chat, as you'll want to check out many of the other offerings this week, including a second webinar that features ReThink's work and my co-director Terrell Bowman on Friday at 9 a.m., which is called Energy Efficiency, a Key Community and Climate Benefit. And I also wanted to take just a moment of privilege to just share with you all one other thing that's coming up in the near future. We have people coming around from around the state to come to our Energy Ball, which is on November 6th in Tallahassee. So feel free to get more information about that or ask for more information. So without further ado, let's get to our speakers. Both of our speakers have long and very distinguished bios that can be found on the Whova app, so I'll just give the highlights. Dr. Andrea Dutton is the Helen Jupnik Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is a world-leading expert on sea level rise. Before joining the University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dr. Dutton was a research fellow at the Australian National University and a faculty member of the University of Florida. Among her many accolades, Dr. Dutton is a MacArthur Fellow, a Fulbright Scholar, a Fellow of the Geological Society of America. She was acknowledged by the Rolling Stone magazine as one of the 25 people shaping the future in tech, science, medicine, activism, and more. She's testified before the US Congress. She's given a TEDx talk and participated in the NOVA documentary that was nominated for an Emmy Award in 2019. So you might be, Dr. Dutton, the first person that I've had on a webinar that has been nominated for an Emmy Award. In recognition of her public engagement, she was recently named as the 2025 recipient of the Geological Society of American Public Service Award. And then Rafe Pomerance, who'll speak after Dr. Dutton, has a long history in climate policy dating back to the late 1970s. From 1993 to 1999, he served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Environment and Development, representing the U.S. at both the Berlin and Kyoto conferences of the parties. Rafe played a key role in bringing climate change to the policy forefront beginning in 1979, and his contributions were highlighted in the New York Times Magazine special issue, Losing Earth, in August 2018, and in a book published shortly thereafter by the same name. In 2014, Rafe Pomerance founded Arctic 21, a network that is focused on communicating the unraveling of the Arctic including the melting of sea ices, glaciers, and permafrost. And more recently, of course, Rafe is a founding member of the Upper Limit Project. So first, I'm going to stop sharing and let's hear from Dr. Dutton.
Okay, thank you, Kim, for that really nice introduction. I'm just going to share my screen here. And are we looking at the right screen, Kim?
Yes, we are.
Great, good. All right, so I should clarify, I was not nominated for an Emmy Award, but the documentary certainly was. So I just wanted to clarify that for the record. So Kim and Rafe asked me to join them here today to give a little bit of an update on the latest science pertaining to sea level rise. And so I'm going to do that for the next 15 minutes or so, and I'm going to keep my part of the conversation pretty high level, but of course, kind of overview. We'll have time for questions afterwards if you want to follow up with more questions on anything that I mentioned here. So this image that you're looking at on the slide today is perhaps familiar to some of you. Kim mentioned I used to live in Florida. I now live in Wisconsin. But it is king tide season in Florida, and so it's a particularly appropriate day, I suppose, in that sense, to be talking about this particular issue. So this is a screenshot that I grabbed from the news yesterday of what's happening currently in Florida, right? These are king tides. King tides themselves are a natural phenomenon, basically related to when the sun and the moon line up in a way that gravity exerts its influence on the surface of the ocean, and we have higher than normal tides. This didn't used to be a problem, but because of the gradual creep upwards of sea level rise, now when we have these high tides, they are flooding our coastlines. And so, in fact, we can predict what this looks like, and there are predictions that get issued so that you can plan ahead for your commute and that type of thing. In fact, today, October 8th, is the highest predicted tide of this king tide. And so my understanding is there are probably lots of people outside right now doing lots of measurements to see exactly how this flooding is going underway. So before I get into the science, I just want to kind of start off and frame this part of the talk a little bit in terms of kind of good news and bad news. So it's true that a certain amount of future sea level rise is already baked into the system, and that's basically based on the amount of warming that has already happened. The ice sheets that we have here on our planet and the mountain glaciers are still equilibrating to this new climate, which has come about really rather quickly. And as they do that, they will continue to lose mass and add water into the oceans. The good news, though, is that this is not completely a done deal, that we do have control on this system in that any action we take to stem our carbon emissions and prevent even, fractions of a degree of warming upwards can change the ultimate outcome of how much sea level rise we have and how fast that occurs, right? So I wanted to see that up front because some of what I'm going to show you might be a little bit depressing, right? But I'll think it's really important not to fall into climate doomism and think, oh, this problem is too big, it's too far gone, there's nothing we can do, because that is certainly not true. So I just wanted to really start off by saying that. The next point that I wanted to make here, so I'm having trouble with my screen, so I apologize for the clicking around. Bad news, I suppose, is that the future will be different, right? So there's sometimes a perception that we can just engineer our way out of this problem. The coastlines are going to change, and they are going to move ultimately. And we know that sea level is going to keep rising. So that future, the future of our coastlines and our coastal communities is going to be different. But the good news, the flip side of this, is that we know that sea level is rising and then it's going to continue to rise. So it's something we can plan for. We can prepare for how we want that to play out. We could also just sit back and watch it happen, and that would be a much more painful experience, right? So there is some control if we are able to develop the social and political will to really tackle this problem at the level that we need to. Okay, so that's the upfront. And now what I'll do is I'll walk through some basics of sea level rise, which many of you may already be familiar with, and then I'll give you a little bit of an update on some of the latest science. So this graph that you're looking at here is a graph of rising sea level that has been measured by satellites that we have orbiting the Earth. So this is the satellite record. This part of the record only started in 1993, so it's really rather short, just a few decades now. But even measuring over these few decades, in here it might be hard to detect with your eye, but there is a statistically significant signal of acceleration in this rate of sea level rise, even across these 3 decades. So that now sea level is rising at the fastest rate in at least the last 2,700 years. And so to look at how it's been accelerating, what you see on the right-hand side now is that over the, from 1901 to 2018, sea level increased by about 8 inches, right? But the rate at which it did so changed across that window. So from 1901 to 1990, it was only about 1.5 millimeters a year. 2006, 2018, it more than doubled, right? 3.7 millimeters a year. Now we're more closer to 4.5 millimeters a year. And while millimeters a year might not sound like a lot, what this translates to is that it took more than a century for sea level to rise 8 inches, as I've listed here. But down at Virginia Key in Florida, it took only 3 decades for sea level to rise an additional 9 inches. Right? So this is really important, this acceleration. It means that we're going to keep that sea level is going to rise faster and faster. And so if we think about it looking at the past 3 decades and thinking that's what we're planning for, it's not, because sea level will continue not just to rise, but to rise at a faster rate, right? And that is one of the big concerns. So this graph is made by Brian McNulty. Some of you may have seen him post some of these things on social media. And this is from the tide gauge at Virginia Key. And what he's showing here is kind of the average position of sea level in the black line across these 3 decades. And the red line is what happens basically in the fall, where we are now, September, October, and November, which naturally, that's the time of year in this region of South Florida and along the East Coast where the tides are naturally the highest, right? And so that's why that red line sits higher than the black line. What's interesting in this data set that he points out is actually at that time of year with the high tides, the rate of sea level rise seems to be even faster than that of kind of average sea level rise, which is an interesting observation. And that's something I'm sure that people are going to be exploring why that actually is. The other thing I want to bring your attention to while we're looking at this diagram is the vertical scale on the left-hand side. And so those numbers are the water level in feet relative to where sea level was on average between 1983 and 2001. That's the datum that it's relative to. So you can see now in this time of year, we're up to about or more than 2 feet above where sea level was right back then between 1983 and 2001. That's a lot, particularly when you think about sea level projections that you might hear about when people are looking at projections of sea level rise and saying, oh, we're not going to have 2 feet of sea level rise for decades to come, right? So I pulled one of these projections as an example. You could take any sea level projection and kind of think about this concept that I'm going to talk about now. And the reason I'm making this point, and I've often made this point in talks I've given, so if you've seen me talk before, you may have seen me give this talk about this previously, is that sometimes when people look at these curves, I feel like they're a little bit misleading, right? For some of the reasons I was just talking about. So if you look at this diagram, this is a sea level projection that was developed by the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. And this is basically a planning tool. So these projections, like you see here, are often used by coastal planners to plan, how high is sea level going to be? I've been in South Florida before. I've had architects talk to me and say, like, just tell me, how high it's going to be in 2060, and I'll build to that level, right? So if you look at this diagram, now the vertical axis is in inches rather than feet, like we saw on the last one. And if you look at this and you find, well, where would 2 feet of sea level rise be? Probably be, if you're looking at this intermediate solid curve here, this intermediate high projection, 2 feet of sea level rise would be 24 inches, right? And so that's probably somewhere around 2050, just kind of reading off of the graph, right? But that our high tides, our king tides, are already reaching levels that are feet above, right? Several feet above. And so when you look at this and think we're not going to reach 2 feet till 2050, actually, we're already reaching high levels. We're just going to reach them more frequently, right? So you've probably seen there's been more and more communication about sea level rise that talks about the frequency of these high tides. And I think that's really a better framework to think about it, because otherwise, when you look at this, I think it's kind of a false sense of complacency that we have time, right? We have time until it's going to reach that level. But in fact, we don't. It's just a question of like, how often are we going to be there until we are there on average all of the time, right? And so I think that's just an important framework to keep in mind when you're looking at some of these scientific projections of sea level rise for the future. Okay, so sea level is rising primarily due to 3 different things. One is the loss of mountain glaciers, which in comparison to ice sheets are relatively small, so they're very vulnerable to warming and they can melt fairly quickly. So you can see some pictures here of a glacier in Alaska that has almost completely retreated in the time frame from the top photo to the bottom photo. Another reason that sea level is rising is because the water in the ocean itself expands by a lot, right? This is a measurable amount at tide gauges. So water has a very high coefficient of thermal expansion. So as you heat it up, the volume of the ocean actually gets bigger just because it is warmer. So that's another component to sea level rise. And then the last component, which I'll probably spend more time talking about, is polar ice sheets that we have in Greenland and Antarctica. And so this graph at the top here is showing you how the mass of water that is locked up in those ice sheets has been decreasing, right, from 2002 to I think it's about 2024 on this particular graph that we're looking at. So we are losing that water. It's going into the oceans from both Greenland and Antarctica, right, at an increasing rate. These pictures down here at the bottom on the right-hand side, those red colors are showing you areas where we are losing the most, right? And so that's what the color scale is. You can see around the edges of the ice sheet, there's some areas where we're losing a lot of ice. So those are the 3 components to sea level rise. It used to be that thermal expansion was kind of the largest factor contributing to sea level rise, but now the acceleration that we've seen in sea level rise is actually largely due to the fact that now we are melting more ice from these polar ice sheets. So the melting of land-based ice is now the dominant source of sea level rise. So that has changed, over the time period that we have been studying this, because it's been accelerating, right? And this is something to be worried about because more than 99% of the world's fresh water is trapped up in these ice sheets, right? So there's a lot at stake here. So one major point of concern is that the sea level contribution from these 2 ice sheets is now 4 times higher than it was in the 1990s, right? So let that sink in a little bit. Over the past few decades, the rate at which we are losing water from these ice sheets and it's going into the ocean has quadrupled. Right? Again, so this is to the point of the acceleration of sea level rise. And so we might have looked at our measurements back then and thought, hey, they look pretty stable. There's not a lot to worry about here. People used to think of these ice sheets as being like sleeping giants. We have woken up the sleeping giants, right? And we are now melting them at increasingly fast rates. One thing that you may hear about in the news a lot is the vulnerability in particular of not just the Antarctic ice sheet, but something called the West Antarctic ice sheet. So I'll just briefly talk about that before I give you some more information about recent updates on sea level rise. So what you're looking at here on the left side of the screen is a side view of the ice sheet of Antarctica. And on the right-hand side, that the big tall bulk, that's East Antarctica. And on the left-hand side is West Antarctica. So you might think, well, shouldn't we be worried about East Antarctica? Looks like there's a lot more ice there. There is, and there's reasons to be worried about that. But the reason that scientists are particularly worried about what's happening in West Antarctica is actually shown when you look at the image on the right side of your screen. So this is a bird's eye view map of Antarctica, and the kind of whitish to blue colors are showing you areas that are below sea level. So even though on the Antarctic continent, we have an ice sheet essentially over the entire continent, that ice sheet is so heavy and thick that it depresses the surface of the land and pushes it down. So now that land surface in many places is actually below sea level. And you can see on the left-hand side of this, and that's the area of West Antarctica over here, right, that most of the West Antarctic ice sheet is in fact based below sea level. So we refer to this as a marine-based ice sheet. And the reason that we are worried about that is that we could lose ice very quickly from that region because essentially of this geometry, right? So here is a diagram on the left now that shows you, now the red colors are showing you how fast the ice is moving. So ice sheets are constantly moving due to gravity. They are flowing and they are discharging ice out off to the edges of this ice sheet. And you can see in West Antarctica, these areas where ice is flowing very quickly into the oceans, right? So this is a cause of concern. Also because of what I mentioned before, the marine-based part of this ice sheet. I don't want to go too much in the weeds here, but I do want to give you some idea of what's happening. If you look at this diagram on the left, this is again kind of a side view, and you can see, imagine this is the West Antarctic ice sheet, here's the ice shelf going out into the ocean. As the ocean waters warm, right, that warm water gets underneath the ice shelf, you're kind of warming the underbelly of this ice sheet. If it retreats past what is labeled here as the grounding line, that's the point where the ice and the ground and the water essentially meet. And right now it's pinned on this high point. If it retreats backwards, it will go into that marine-based area that's basically like a bowl. And once it starts going back into the bowl, there's nothing to stop it. There are no more pinning points. And so it will continue retreating into that bowl. That's what we refer to as a tipping point. So once we cross that tipping point, it will continue, right? And we can't just regrow the ice sheet if we decide, okay, now it's time to lower our emissions because we crossed the tipping point. You know, we're gonna be on track to lose that part of the ice sheet essentially if we lose that. There's another type of instability shown on the right-hand side, which relates to the surface melting, like the picture that I just showed you a couple of slides ago. That was a picture actually of the Antarctic ice sheet, where we had this meltwater on the surface that gets into some of the cracks, and it can cause the ice shelf to essentially crack up and disappear. If that happens and it retreats to a point where you get a very tall cliff of ice, if that cliff gets too tall, it can basically fail because mechanically it is not strong enough to hold itself up, right? And so there are debates about, you know, how tall would this cliff have to get before it would fail, and how fast would this cause ice to retreat. But nonetheless, physically, this is pretty well understanding that if you reach this point, it will rapidly accelerate the retreat of ice as you're basically losing ice also off of this cliff face. So that's another type of tipping point that we are worried about reaching with these ice sheets. So this is to say that even though sea level rise is accelerating now, if we cross one or both of these tipping points, it will accelerate even more, right? And go even faster. So earlier this year, I was part of a group of people who put together a review paper to kind of assess what we understand, both looking at past behavior of ice sheets under past warm periods, what we understand from looking at modern observations of ice sheets, and what we also understand from all the ice sheet models and what that is telling us. The title of this paper, right, is not, I guess, too positive. It says, warming of 1.5 degrees is too high for the polar ice sheets. There are three main points in this paper that I want to touch on here. And sorry, they all appeared at once. I was going to have them appear one at a time. So let's take them in one at a time. On the upper right-hand corner, the first point I want to make is that when we look at all of this collected evidence, even a best case scenario of 1.5 degrees is not going to prevent global mean sea level from rising in the future and even from accelerating. So one of the reasons we wrote this paper is we found that when we talk to people, especially in the general public, there's a notion that, well, if we keep warming to only 1.5 degrees, which honestly is a best case scenario, that's unlikely, but that if we only limit to 1.5 degrees, then that's somehow safe, right? And so we wanted to make sure that people understood this is not necessarily safe, right? This is going to lead to quite a bit of sea level rise, even 2 degrees. So it's not necessarily a safe target, right? It is an admirable target, right? And one that we absolutely should be reaching towards. But in fact, we may have already passed a safe target. So point number 2, there's a growing body of evidence that the present climate state, like where we are at right now even, could trigger rapid retreat in Greenland and Antarctica because we are close enough to those tipping points that I just talked about that actually some scientists are arguing whether or not we have already crossed some of them. The problem with these tipping points is that we won't really know exactly where the tipping point is until we're past it. And we say like, oh, there it was. And now sea level's rising a lot faster because now we're past that tipping point. So to point number 3, given that these tipping points will probably not be apparent until after they have been passed, it's really imperative that we act now and not wait until we see evidence that we have passed those tipping points. So those are the 3 main takeaways that I wanted to highlight for you from that paper. What that means for Florida, sometimes I get frustrated with the images that I see in the popular media about what sea level rise would look like because they're too dramatic. So I'll show you an image. If I had had time, I would have set up an online poll. You could have told me, do you think this looks dramatic and unreasonable for how much sea level rise we should expect from the amount of warming we've already had? Well, this is most of South Florida underwater, right? I will tell you that in the past, for a time period that I have studied in a lot of detail, when we got temperatures to the level that we are at now today, the ice sheets did retreat. And this is what Florida looked like if you look at the black outline here, this plus 6 meter shoreline, if you will. So in fact, when it got this warm in the past, what this map is telling us that South Florida was underwater. In fact, there are marine sediments from this time period when we reached the same level of warmth that we have today, right? That show us that's how much sea level rose, right? It didn't happen all at once, but it did. That's how the ice sheets eventually equilibrated to that amount of warming. So in fact, this particular picture is perhaps not really dramatic in terms of what we should expect. So some parting thoughts. I think a lot of times when people are talking about sea level rise and talking about planning, they get hung up on uncertainty. They get like, which projection is right? And there's so much uncertainty. What is going to happen? I want to flip that narrative around for you and tell you that we are certain that not only the seas are rising, but that they are going to continue to rise long into the future, even based on the amount of warming that has already happened. That sea level rise is a gradual process. So sometimes it seems like it's not a big deal, right? Millimeters per year doesn't sound alarming. But as I showed you earlier, the frequency and the severity of that coastal flooding is only expected to increase into the future. Advanced planning is key, right? I know that's the hard part, but that is the necessary part. And yes, to end on a positive note, we absolutely can make a difference. Every fraction of a degree of warming that we can prevent will help to reduce the amount of ice lost and help us to avoid reaching some of these dangerous tipping points in the ice sheets I spoke about before. So I'm going to leave it there and hand off to Rafe now. Rafe, I think you're muted.
How's that?
There you go.
Thank you for the rescue there. Yeah. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. Um, I'm Rafe Pomerance. I've been at the climate issue for almost 50 years now. Started in the late 1970s when nobody knew it was an issue. And here we are with Andrea's presentation of astonishing future before us if we allow things to continue. And I've been involved in organizing congressional hearings, in trying to pass climate legislation. I did, as Kim mentioned, I served in the U.S. State Department for 6 years in the Clinton administration as a climate negotiator, and have run or attempted to run various campaigns on different aspects of the issue. And I'm so glad to be here with both Kim and Andrea to discuss a campaign that we have framed up and are trying to put into action. And as Kim mentioned, it's called the Upper Limit Campaign. And the idea behind this that we really formulated in Florida was to, we asked the question, kind of an early question, how much sea level rise is too much? You know, what can Florida take? And that sort of tended to enter the question, okay, if you're the governor of Florida, how much sea level rise is too much? What's your limit? Is there a limit? And the answer, of course, is there is no specific legal or political limit to sea level rise. And our campaign is about trying to change that framework. Because as the global negotiations have taken place, as we all know, there's one metric in the global climate system, and that's temperature. And there's a goal of 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade as the limit to which the nations of the world should strive. And the problem that we see with that limit is that it doesn't drive policy strongly enough. It doesn't motivate policy because our theory is that global temperature doesn't mean much to a lot of people. It's just not connected to specific impacts. And our view is that sea level rise is much more connected to the way people experience and see the world and will want to know what's coming. So we've begun to formulate this framework and this campaign of the upper limit. And it has a few key points to it. Number one is that, number one is that the idea is to, how do we want to set an upper limit globally. But the limit has to be set within the context of the science, because the science says no matter what you do, at least for a very long time, there's going to continue to be sea level rise because of the amount of warming that the Earth has already experienced due to human activity, which in turn means that there's going to be ice melt for as long as that warming continues. It has to reach an equilibrium with the rest of the system, which takes a very long time. So we're locked into a rate to warming for the foreseeable future. However, the question that we have come upon is, in talking about this upper limit, is the question of, which Andrea's presentation refers to very nicely, is what's the rate? The rate is something we can control. We can have and her presentation showed a number of different scenarios about rate. So our view, the goal that we set within this campaign is, the way we define it, is to achieve the lowest possible rate of increase of sea level rise. That's the goal of the upper limit campaign, because you can't stop sea level rise, but you can ensure that it occurs as slowly as possible, and perhaps at some point we will figure out how to stop it altogether. But the difference between one rate and another is enormous. And if we allow emissions to climb as rapidly as they are now, we're going to have much faster, much greater amounts of sea level rise. And of course, this puts the entire future of Florida at stake, right? I mean, Florida is a highly vulnerable, low-lying peninsula that we all know is hugely vulnerable. And the more rapidly that sea level rise occurs, the greater the damages, the greater the vulnerability, the greater the political impacts, and so on. So Florida, in our minds, should be in the forefront of the leadership of an upper limit campaign. Now, what's also just a couple other points here is that we see this campaign can go global very easily because the rest of the world, there are huge vulnerabilities all over the planet to sea level rise. Countries in every continent, every hemisphere, both hemispheres, there are allies everywhere, and there are allies on U.S. coastal states. I learned this week, actually, that Massachusetts has more coastline than Florida. I did not know that because we think of Massachusetts as a potential leader here. But so allies in the struggle to establish the upper limit and achieve it can come at the state level, the local level, because all local governments have a stake in this outcome, and at the global level. Now, we had a retreat the other day of our little team on this, and turned out that about a week before the retreat, there was an announcement that put Miami and the state of Florida right in the middle of all this. And you may not have thought about this yet, but in 2026, the G20 meeting, the meeting of all the world's great powers, will be in Miami, which is an opportunity to bring the issue forward in a big way if we organize right. It's not guaranteed. In fact, because this is a Trump event, I mean, he's the host and it's going to be his golf course, and he has explicitly denied that sea level is rising, you wouldn't think he'd put it front and center. But that doesn't mean we can't do a lot with the fact that the G20 meeting is going to be in Miami. And the one-liner we came up with, at least for the moment, was that save Miami, save the world. Because you can't, turns out you can't save the Miami without saving the world. Because Miami's fate is dependent on global emissions. So, but here's, as somebody who's been in the political organizing field, maybe this G20 meeting offers a big opportunity to bring attention to the issue. A second point I just want to make, Andrea's paper that she referred to is quite profound, quite profound. I can't tell you, I lost quite a bit of sleep after I read that paper because it brings home this issue of the vulnerability of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, where we have many, many, many meters of potential sea level rise. Greenland's 24 feet, Antarctica is, I don't know, a couple of 100 feet ultimately. I don't know what the number is exactly, and they're shrinking. They're shrinking. And this is one of the great challenges to the world, to humanity, going forward over coming years, decades, and centuries. We cannot lose the ice sheets. And remember, I said one of our goals was to lower the rate of sea level rise to the lowest possible level. Another goal that we set out is to stop the loss of the ice sheets. Now, maybe that's a bit over the top in terms of ambition, but it has to be a focus for the world. In other words, we're entering into an entire new planetary system with the ice sheets shrinking. Because the world, when there were no ice sheets, was vastly, vastly, vastly different. So that's before us as well. And what Andrea's paper did so well is to lay all that out. What a big deal this is in front of us. Now, my last thing I want to say is how important Florida, its citizenry, its politics, its leadership is in all this, because Florida is facing all of this very squarely, already experiencing impacts, but they're not going to stop. They're only going to grow. They're only going to accelerate. And the rate of growth and acceleration is dependent on the human response. And the only way you get that response is through leadership and action. And I always thought my first adventure to Florida on climate change was when Lawton Childs, if any of you remember, was governor. And we had a really good meeting in Tallahassee about this. He got it right away. And but this is the great challenge before us all, and in particular in Florida. But you have a great opportunity to lead. No kidding. Save Miami, save the world. So I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you, Rafe, and thank you, Andrea. Andrea, if you want to come off, put your video back on, then we can have all three of us on screen for questions and answers. We have a couple questions in the chat that I'm going to ask. And if anybody does have questions, please feel free to put it in the chat on Zoom or in the Q&A on the Whova app, and we will do our best to get these answered. I do want to ask one question of each of you, and then we'll get to the questions in the chat. So, and then I have a final question that I'll ask. So for Rafe, why an upper limit to sea level rise, and what does that do that 1.5 degrees doesn't do? Uh-oh.
Well, we're not calling for, do you want me to respond?
Yes, sorry, you froze briefly.
So the relationship between the upper limit and 1.5 degrees, was I said, I don't know if I made it clear enough, but we're calling for a second metric in the climate system to supplement the 1.5 degree metric or 2 degree metric. And our theory is that the sea level rise issue will motivate policy far more with greater urgency than the global temperature number, which doesn't translate very easily into impacts. You have to translate it impacts where sea level rise is a direct impact affecting hundreds of millions of people. So that's how we see the relationship. We're not trying to say 1.5 is useless. No, it's been very important. What we are saying is that we need more, and we need greater urgency on a greater scale. And the sea level rise issue, thanks to people like Andrea, is there. It must be confronted.
Thanks, Rafe. And for Andrea, my question for you is, I was actually, like, even though I've been working on this issue with Rafe for quite a while now, you know, your point that you made relatively early on about the rise being put in the graphs being the mean and not the high tide, and certainly not the king high tide. How does a planner work with these numbers? And is there anything that, excluding storm surge, gives like the high tide or king tide version of those projections into the future?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there absolutely are projections of frequency of reaching those high tide levels, right? NOAA has established different levels of, what it means to have a high tide in different locations along the coastline. And those are available. There's some NOAA reports. There, even before the projection I showed you was from the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. They also have a figure in there that relates to frequency of flooding, right? And I think there's just been maybe historically this tendency to lean on those nice curves of sea level projections and think about that as being the primary planning tool. But like I said, I think it leads to a misperception that, okay, we're not going to reach that level for, maybe any decades. Whereas we're already reaching that level. It's just that we'll reach it more frequently until we're there on average. And in that sense, I think sea level rise is going to happen much faster than people think it will, right? Because they are looking at these graphs thinking, we've got time, right? So yeah, that's a great question, but that information is available because scientists have been thinking about this in terms of the impacts. But like, what does it mean to live in a place where, you reach that high tide level once a year? Well, what about 3 times a year? Well, what if it's 3 days in a row, right? Or so and that really does make a difference. Like, what can you tolerate? Can you tolerate your house getting flooded once, twice, 5 times? Like, what's your breaking point? And so it really is important to think in terms of that metric of the frequency of flooding.
Thanks, Andrea. So let me ask a couple of these questions that are in the chat. First, Ted asks, what is the historical low level of world ice? And what does that translate into for sea levels? And then what were the carbon saturation global temperatures that created it? I don't know if you have that off the top of your head there, Andrea.
I do, because I'm a geologist. Yep.
Awesome.
That's definitely in my wheelhouse. So there are periods in Earth's history where it has been ice-free, right? So when you say low ice, there have been times when there have been no ice. But there are certain preconditions to having a lot of ice on land. And one of those is that you have a lot of land at high latitudes, right? So currently now, continent of Antarctica is right over the South Pole, right? So it is a place where then we can accumulate ice. And if we did not have land at high latitudes, let's say all the continents were focused on the equator, which has happened in Earth's history, right? That would be a different situation. And so the last time the Earth was ice-free was actually something like 34 million years ago, a long time in the Eocene. But it wouldn't be fair to directly compare, what was the carbon dioxide level then or the temperature that led to that condition, because that's long enough ago that the continents were in very different positions. And ocean circulation that moves heat around the globe was very different. And so it's not really analogous to our current configuration in terms of land and ice sheets. But I can tell you that if we melted all the ice on Antarctica and Greenland, we'd be adding something like 60 meters of ice, 60 meters of water rise into the oceans. Probably as the land adjusts to that, even more in places. So it would be a lot. Now, 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees is not going to melt the entire ice sheet. So that's definitely not what I was saying. But sectors of these ice sheets, yes, could absolutely be lost with just that amount of warming. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Ted, for the question.
Sure. And speaking of the circulation of our currents, Ted also asked, what effect will the shutdown of the AMOC, or the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, I believe is what that stands for, have on our sea rise rate and then the reversal process as the ice age sets in, if there is a
Right.
reversal process?
So Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, you are exactly right, relates to some ocean circulation that we have in the North Atlantic. And the rate of sea level rise is not constant around the globe. There are lots of different factors that lead to regional differences. Some have to do with land movement up and down. There are gravity effects and so forth. I'm not going to get into all of that. But Ted is right that if the strength of that current changes, so if it weakens, it can actually change some rates of sea level rise. In particular, along the east coast of the United States, we would expect to see higher rates of sea level rise, particularly focused north of Cape Hatteras. That would be a part that would be hardest hit by that, if you will, in terms of increasing the rate of sea level rise. And so there are impacts, because if you change the rates of ocean circulation, it's literally changing how fast you're moving water around the ocean. It can cause it to essentially kind of pile up in different places, depending on the strengths of these currents. And that's what's happening there. Weakening the AMOC, or when people talk about a shutdown of the AMOC, there's no reason to think that that's going to cause an ice age to set in. And that was part of Ted's question too. So it could mean less transport. It would mean less transport of heat northwards that would have an impact on weather patterns and particularly impact Europe, that has a nice warm climate because of all the heat that travels northward on those currents. So there would be changes, but not to cause an ice age, because to do that, you'd have to start building up ice. That means that your summers would have to be cool enough to allow the snowfall to stick around and accumulate ice. And that wouldn't be enough to cool our summers enough compared to where we're at now, right, to allow that to happen.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I will also ask from Christopher, this possibly somewhat, and this is for both of you, somewhat controversial question, but any thoughts on geoengineering solutions? And he points out one that's been put forth about injecting water into ice shells to allow it to refreeze and bolster the shells in the short term. It buys time, but doesn't solve the warming problem, he says. And I'll also just point out that I think at this point, everyone might be speaking individually. Our organization and the Upper Limit Project neither has taken on a position on geoengineering. So, Rafe, you want to take that one to
Yeah,
your thoughts?
I think we've entered into a new period on this subject. I don't know whether there are geoengineering responses that can significantly alter the trajectory, or at least even for a period of time. But the debate going on in the climate policy community has shifted, I would say, that there is a legitimacy now that didn't exist before to discuss geoengineering responses, of which there are many. And I would say that what you need, a number of years ago, we started it was actually a successful campaign in the Congress to establish something called ARPA-E, which is the Advanced Research Projects Administration Energy, which was modeled on DARPA, which was a defense advanced research project. The ARPA-E was designed to put money into high-risk, non-carbon producing energy systems. It wasn't geoengineering, but it was the organization of a research entity to look at these things. And I think that's what's coming. There has to be a look, because we don't know enough about whether there's a tool or many tools, or what the risks are. And achieving scientific consensus, political consensus is very, very difficult. However, as dramatic as if things continue to get more and more dramatic and the impacts become clearer in the future, that adds some energy to the research effort on geoengineering. And there are many scientists who feel the risks are too great. It's a sort of a double. If we don't use it, what are the risks? If we do use it, what are the risks? Anyway, go on and on, all the issues. I just say there's a lot more momentum behind looking at different options. What emerges. Actually, one of the more interesting articles I was just reading about is how they're probably all fictional, but what can you do about the ice sheets? How do you get underneath them, build wall, whatever? I'm sure Andrea has seen some of that, but I think it's just an issue that will it sort of come out of the woods a bit into the open air as an issue to look at. Because of how far gone we are, how much warming is already in the system, how much is coming, and what the consequences of that are, and how long it takes to turn around the system.
And Andrea, what are your thoughts?
Look, the geoengineering things that have been proposed for ice sheets in particular, most of them basically scare me. And I think there's a point in this question that was raised in the chat that's important to think about, is that this person said, maybe this particular solution he was talking about could buy us some time, right? Doesn't solve the problem, might buy us some time to deal with it. And this is a problem to me, because even along our coastlines, so let's say someone builds a seawall, right? A seawall is a temporary solution, right? At some point, the seawall is going to fail or it's going to get topped, right? We've seen that happen in New Orleans. It will happen in other places, right? It's a temporary solution. It's really meant to buy time. Can you tell me a place where people have built a seawall and now people are moving out because they're using it to buy time so that they can, manage the retreat and plan for what's coming? No, the opposite's happening. If you build a wall, people are like, hey, it's safe. Real estate values go up. We're going to buy here. We're going to keep building here more because now we have a wall. So in general, these things that are like, okay, let's buy us some time. Show me you're going to use that time, right? Is a rarely important precursor to even entertaining any geoengineering solution that's really something that's going to buy time.
That's an interesting point, Andrea. Thank you. Okay, so I'll ask one more question here, and then I'll do my final question. Does the lunar perigee cycle over 8-ish years impact the rate of sea level rise? Andrea, I think that one's for you.
So I'm glad you asked this question, because I should clarify that when I was talking about rates of sea level rise, I'm talking about long-term rates of sea level rise. When we talk about climate in general, we're talking about long-term. Even weather forecasters, if they use the word climate, they're talking about at least 30 years of data, right? And so there's this signal of the long-term sea level rise that's due to climate change. Now, around that long-term signal that I was talking about, of the rate of rise and the acceleration, there's some variability in sea level rise, short-term variability, for lots of reasons, because there are a lot of things that affect tides. Winds affect tides, yes, the perigee cycle, right? Lots of different things. So yeah, that affects some of this short-term variability, but it does not impact this long-term signal that I'm talking about that's induced from global warming, right? So I hope that clarifies the issue for you.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, so my last question, and feel free to also take into account some of the questions that are hitting at the same thing in the chat as you answered this. So I wanted to wrap up with, what is one thing you would say to people that help them continue to be hopeful, or what is one thing you think people listening on this call can do to take action? So if you want to address that one, you want to go first, Rafe?
Yeah, sure. Well, good question. Since this is the Florida Climate Week, I would say two things. I think, well, one is generally Floridians, local governments, they have a huge role to play because of the vulnerability. Florida can bring the message to the United States and the world if well organized. So I think Florida is kind of political entity. I know it's kind of tough to describe, but has a potentially huge role to play because the state's future is at stake. The second is this immediate opportunity, it's a year off, of the G20. And that's a place where we can make a stand. It doesn't have to expect to affect the outcome of the words of the G20. But here, all the heads of state from around the world will gather in a place where the existence of which is up in the air.
And I will put into the chat how people can stay tuned to both this campaign as well as the organization. And Andrea, what's your answer to that question?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And someone in the chat mentioned something about, like, I know there's no silver bullet, right? So, and it's true, but I think the joy in that is there are so many different ways that we can tackle this, right? So, and sometimes people think that they would have to change, what they do in order to really make a difference. But it doesn't matter what you do. You could be a banker, a filmmaker, a teacher. any profession, and you can think about how you can have an influence on this issue, whether it's either raising awareness or helping people to connect the dots on the issue, or it could be something more direct. You know, how does your organization conduct itself in a way? Are there changes you could make, right? And some of these might seem like small changes if it's something that just you're doing, but sometimes change is nonlinear. And this is also very true when it comes to activism and climate activism. So I'll point to one example, which is Greta Thunberg, right? Here's a girl who decided to, you know, sit outside and go on strike and say, hey, I've had enough of this. And look at what a global movement it turned into. So while whatever it is you're doing to make a difference might seem small, at some point that small change might hit an inflection point, and it's nonlinear, right? And I think the more we do, the better. And the more different ways we tackle this problem, the better. And so if we all put our creative minds to it, then we are going to make a difference.
All right, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Dutton. Thank you, Rafe, and thank you everyone for attending. We really appreciate you all, and thank you to Volo Foundation as well. And we'll look forward to seeing you all in future Florida Climate Week events. Thank you.